Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Dan Griffin, and I'm going to be online with you today to introduce our speakers, kicking off each subject for discussion and answering or forwarding any of your additional questions to our speakers. But just a few housekeeping points before we begin. You'll notice that we've muted everybody automatically. This is to ensure that we have minimal noise disruption throughout the whole webinar, but you will notice that there is a chat box on your screen that you can use to send me messages directly, which I will either answer privately or forward to our speakers if you have any questions you'd like answered in this session. So please do make use of that. You'll also find in that window we've placed a few additional resources for you to download as well. One is the white paper that accompanies today's session. This outlines what a ULA is, why you probably got into one, and why and how you should get out of it. I highly recommend downloading it for future reference. The other download is a fact book that gives you information on third-party support and Support Revolution specifically, outlining the pros and cons of why you would consider moving from Oracle support to us, something that you can only do when you've successfully escaped your Oracle ULA. And obviously, I'd recommend downloading that as well. But on to the reason why we're all here today. If you're watching this, we're assuming that you're locked into an Oracle ULA. You may or may not have signed the original agreement or even the latest renewal, but you're now wondering why you are still locked into this agreement and how to find your way out of it. But why are you looking to escape your ULA in the first place? Unlimited usage sounds great, right? And how difficult can it really be to just cancel a contract before renewal? Hopefully you're raising your eyebrows right now because you're probably aware of the quickly escalating costs that a ULA can bring and the many tricks Oracle can employ to keep you trapped in one. So is there anything you can do? To help answer these questions, we've asked two experts from Oracle to share their knowledge and best practices on Oracle ULAs, their pros, their cons, and their escape methods. The first expert is Support Revolution's founder and CEO, Mark Smith. Mark originally founded the Oracle and SAP consultancy PDG Consulting in 1998, before refocusing the company into Support Revolution in 2012. Mark has over 20 years of experience working with both Oracle and SAP customers across the globe, and as the CEO of Support Revolution brings unrivaled knowledge of how to get the most out of your Oracle support services and contracts. Hello, Mark. Our second guest is Forrester's global software vendor negotiation expert, Mark Bartrick. Mark's focus at Forrester is helping businesses save money on their software and SaaS contracts through advising and coaching them through negotiations with vendors like Microsoft, SAP, Salesforce, and of course, Oracle. Mark has a wealth of knowledge of the tools and tactics you can use to tip a negotiation in your favor, as well as the tactics your vendor will try to use to stop you. Hello, Mark, and thank you for joining us. I'm sure everyone will agree that we're incredibly lucky to get the pair of you talking together on this topic, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what tactics and tips you both have to share. So the best place to start off this conversation would be asking you, Mark Smith, what is an unlimited license agreement?
An Oracle Unlimited License Agreement is it's a vehicle where if you're a really growing organization and you've got lots of projects on the go and you need to basically, you need lots of software to help you deliver them, then an unlimited license agreement is a great vehicle for that, because what it does is it gives you access to a set number of Oracle products. But you can have as many licenses as you want within that. So it's a vehicle that's used a lot by companies that are growing very quickly and want access to software and don't want to keep negotiating one agreement after another. So it's a vehicle for fast-growing organisations. It's based around technology products. There are other forms of ULA. I think it's called an ELA for which is around ERP, and PULA. But the majority are ULAs, and what they cover is a whole raft of technical products, so database, application server in the past, all sorts of options, and it's all bundled up into one agreement.
Yeah, if I could jump in at that point, Mark. So, great introduction, and ULAs are good for some people, as we're going to talk about in this webinar, and they're not good for other people, as we'll talk about in this webinar. But I think it's always good to point out right up front, we're talking about unlimited license agreement here, which is a little bit of a misnomer because they're not unlimited. They are limited by term, 3 years, usually maybe 5. They're limited by products. Not all Oracle products will be in the stack, or just be a subset. Some of those products be capped, so they're not unlimited. It'd be limited by geography, be limited by usage, and it'll be limited in the sense that there's not a lot of flexibility in the ULA to do nice things or to do things during pandemics where you may want to save money. So unlimited, it's in there, it's their title, it's their terminology, but I would always challenge it. It's not unlimited, but for some clients, the structure of it can be very good.
It's a great summary, Mark. And I think one of the things we ought to explain as well is how these Oracle ULAs happen. So Oracle meet with the customer. The customer has a great set of projects to deliver and a big demand for software. So the customer and Oracle agree what products they want. They estimate the demand, and then they negotiate a figure for a capital investment. So it's all about understanding the software that you need, not necessarily the volume, but rough volumes, and then agreeing a figure with Oracle, and then off you go. So that's how you start with the ULA.
Okay, so now we know what a ULA is. Why did so many organizations sign up to a ULA in the first place? Mark B, if I could get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. There's a lot of clients signed up to this. I mean, thousands and thousands globally have signed up to this kind of licensing agreement. And there are some decent reasons why you would enter into a ULA. As we put on the screen here, unlimited usage. I might have said about how much they are limiting and not so much unlimited, but actually for the product set and product stack that you've got in a ULA, you can use unlimited numbers of those products for the duration of the term. So that has a tremendous advantage for companies who are significantly growing and scaling as an organization and maybe can't even estimate or forecast even how many databases or whatever it is they're putting into the ULA. And for that reason, it's great for a scaling organization. So anyone who's scaling fast, and over the years, many companies go through high growth periods, ULA can be a very useful mechanism to license Oracle from, because potentially if you do it right, and you get the numbers right, you can potentially get free licenses and free support effectively during the term. And if it's managed right, there's some goodness there. Another reason for getting into a ULA is the initial cost helps with financial planning. Of course it does. If you know your Oracle spend for the next 3 years is going to be X, IT likes that, finance likes that, auditing like that, exactly where your numbers are going to be. So there's going to be no spikes and troughs. There's going to be no running back to the CFO for extra budget to buy extra licenses because you just underestimated. All of those games are gone, and you can sit back and just enjoy the product and drive value out of it. And the third reason on the list here is it's a simple bundled agreement. And a lot of Oracle customers who've been with them for many, many years have grown up with Oracle and have started lots of different products and projects. They've got lots of contracts out there with different end dates, different products mixed and matched. They've acquired companies. So it's quite a mess of contractual obligations to Oracle, not only to manage and for billing purposes and asset management purposes, but it's a lot of mess. So why not simplify everything into one agreement, one ULA, and just go forward on that? Simplified billing, simplified administration, one simple bundled agreement. It's very appealing. Mark, did you want to cover the other 3 items on the list?
Thanks, Mark, and you made some great points there. With they can look very attractive at the outset, and I'll come on to that in a little bit on the business case one. But yes, also the lower risk of audits. If you agree with Oracle that you're doing a lot of projects and you've got lots of software that you want to use, and they know that at the end of a 3-year period there's going to be a true up, and basically they're going to then write a line under it and say, right, there's your license grant. Then they know that you're in the midst of everything, and so there's a lower risk of audits, potentially. As we come on to explain a bit later, that's not necessarily always the case, but at the outset you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, yeah, great, we know what we're doing, we're going to set off on that journey, and we're not going to have to worry about somebody knocking on the door wanting to count the number of licenses we use all the time. And there really is a compelling business case for these things when you look at them at the start. Oracle speaking to you saying you can have as much software as you like, and you say to them, well, I think I want to use 50 CPUs worth of licenses of database for these systems here, and you agree a price for those 50 CPUs. And then in 3 years' time, you finish your projects and you find that you've actually used 150, your quid's in because you've only paid for 50, and it sounds great. And it's a fantastic business case at the start, so you're eager to sign up because it looks such a great deal. And also, back in the day, people always used to have an Oracle or maybe a Microsoft strategy. You know, your IT strategy was based around, I'm going to use everything that Oracle's got, and that's my strategy. And so what people did was kind of just buy the farm and then say, well, you know, I'm going to use all this stuff because I've made an Oracle strategy. So it tended to be back in the day to be Oracle or Microsoft. You know, if you're a smaller company, you did Microsoft. If you're a bigger company, you did Oracle, and that was it. And so these ULAs, you know, a lot of them are older. They still do sell some, but, you know, a lot of them are historic. You know, they might be 3, 6, 10, even 15 years old, some of them. But you know, when you had an Oracle strategy, it seems a great deal. So compelling reasons. Mark, anything to add?
No, I think you summarized it really well.
Thanks for that. So we know why people initially chose a ULA, but why has Oracle created this product? What's in it for Oracle? If I could get your thoughts on that, Mark B, to begin with.
Sure, thanks, Dan. Oracle love ULAs, I have to say. I mean, if they could sell any licensing agreement going forward from today, it's a ULA every time. And the reason they love it is a number of things. First off, it's revenue lock-in. It guarantees revenues for a period of time, typically 3 to 5 years on a ULA. So from that perspective, it's nice financially for them to lock in revenues for a fixed period of term. Of course, they like it. Their, you know, Oracle CFO like it. Their stockholders like it. You know, you can revenue recognize that over a period of time, and you don't have to do too much to actually earn it once it's signed up for that 3 or 5 years. And of course, during those 3 or 5 years of the term, it's also a great vehicle for clients to use more and more and more Oracle licenses. They're encouraged to. It's unlimited. So, you know, just spin them out, deploy them, try things out, try different projects with databases, whatever it is. You know, you've got unlimited use, you might as well. So Oracle love the fact you get guaranteed revenues, they get guaranteed revenues. They love the fact that it encourages wider deployment. And clearly in that wider deployment could be competitive knockout. You know, so if you've got a lot of databases with SAP, S4HANA, or if you've got Microsoft SQL, SQL, you know, it's a potential way that they can try and leverage those databases out, replace them with Oracle's product, or whatever else is in the stack. So guaranteed revenues and competitive knockout. But also another big thing that this ULA does, and there's two more. One is competitive lockout, and one is it restricts clients' options to save money and flexibility during the term. So the competitive lockout's important because if they get you on an unlimited license agreement, it's unlikely you're going to go to any other vendor during that term to buy similar sort of products you're going to pay extra money for. They're just going to say, well, look, you've got an unlimited pot here. Just use more Oracle. Just keep using Oracle. So to a degree, it locks out competition for the period. Now, if you're all in with Oracle for the product set that you're on database or applications, whatever it may be, that's fine. You're not looking elsewhere. But if you did want to consider your options, then the ULA kind of precludes that and excludes that. So it's kind of restrictive from that regard. It's also restrictive, to my fourth point, is it's also restricted in the sense that if you want to look at alternate support mechanisms, for example, third-party support, you're locked out of that during the ULA because it's a bundled agreement and you can't take chunks out of it. It's all or nothing. You're in for the ULA term. So Oracle like that because they've seen some of their revenues eroded over the years, and quite a lot of their revenues eroded over the years actually to third-party support suppliers for many of the right reasons, you know, let alone save money. But if you can lock a client into a ULA, you lock out third-party support for that period of time. Now that's good for Oracle, of course it is, but it's taking away an option from customers. And look at the world we live in today and the pandemic that's running around. I know we're going to talk about it later, but you know, if you want to save money, suddenly one of your options is off the table in a ULA. Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned yet is Oracle ULAs are a fantastic vehicle for Oracle. Basically, and we'll explain it in a bit more detail later on, but it locks you in for many more years than the 3 years typically. So the typical client doesn't get a fantastic deal because they don't deliver projects that they thought they were going to deliver and get, you know, 150 CPU price licenses for the price of 50. What in the real world happens is they generally don't do that, and I won't spoil the story to come because it's quite detailed. But Oracle get a massive amount of revenues from ULAs and far more than you would think. So, and we'll explain how that works a little bit later on.
So given all that you've covered, who are ULAs good for in today's world then? Mark Smith, if I could ask you to start.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, ULAs are good for organisations scaling at a fast pace. You know, if you're a company that is growing exponentially, not too many of those these days with the pandemic, but if you're growing really rapidly and you think, well, you know what, I'm happy with the Oracle product set, I'm going to use that to develop a number of systems, then they are a good tool, provided you keep them under control. So, you know, at the outset, having access to all these software products and knowing what you're deploying, having a strategy that is 100% focused on Oracle, so you know that the assumption there is that all these products are going to fit together, going to work together, and you know, maybe even some of them pre-integrated, all that type of stuff. So if you're just delivering lots of enterprise applications and complex IT architectures, you know, there's loads of tools there, lots of Oracle products, pretty much everything that you could need to deploy these systems. So, you know, so when you set out from this journey, you feel quite confident that you've got a big set of products to choose from, and you can deliver a number of systems. And obviously, the last thing, as Mark said, these ULAs are really good for Oracle because they are a huge revenue generator.
They are, Mark, and it's just finish off on the slide there. I think there are clients out there where ULAs, I mean, they're good. All of them are good for Oracle. Put it that way. They're all good for Oracle. But there are some customers out there that ULAs are good for. As you said, any organization that is growing at pace, scaling at pace, perhaps even unforecastable space. You know, you can't even tell how many database licenses you need in a year or 2 or 3 or whatever it is, or whatever applications. You know, you're just ramping. And you just want to get product in as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and you don't have to worry about another purchase order here or getting some more budget there, and next month you do the same again. You just want to get a license mechanism in place that allows you to grow at pace, draw down licenses as many as you need, and get your business moving forward on that basis. You know, a ULA is a really good framework and licensing mechanism to do that. And so for those organizations who are looking at that as their near-term future, next 3 years, next 5 years, this can be a really good licensing model. We talked about earlier about simplifies things, makes budgeting easier. But if you're growing at pace, then a lot of clients who've done that, and I've got experience of this with other clients where they've grown at pace through a ULA, they've gone way beyond the financially costed usage, and they've got into using licenses that you can call for free. They got extra licenses that they never anticipated. They're not paying support on it for the duration of the ULA term. So they've really maximized value out of a ULA. And so if you're one of those lucky customers or lucky businesses that's absolutely flying or anticipates doing that over the next 3 to 5 years, a ULA is a fabulous, you know, tool to use and a great way to license your products.
So it sounds like if you get the ULA right, it can be a really beneficial agreement. But what about the reverse of that? Who are ULAs bad for? Mark Smith, if I can ask you to start.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, as we said earlier, ULAs are great if you're growing fast, if you've got lots of projects, if you're in control of exactly what you're doing. But where the ULA is not good for you is when your estate starts to either become static or decline. Because one of the things is that you know, when you made that ULA license agreement with Oracle, you did it around a set of products and a number of licenses that you're going to deploy. Now, if you didn't hit those numbers, then you're a loser because you're still paying for those licenses whether you use them or not. So, you know, that's when you become a big loser, is if you bought a 50 processor ULA and you only deployed 10, then you're still paying for 50. And you will pay support for 50 going on. So you really have to be a growing organization, and you really have to understand how you're using these ULAs if you're not going to get caught with that. So a clear roadmap and defined milestones, but understanding, you know, the deployment of those licenses. And for example, what people don't do is they don't put the ULA milestone into a project plan. So, for example, let's say you're delivering 3 projects and they're over 3 years. You don't have a big red flag saying, I've got to get this done by that date because my ULA ends then. But people tend to think, oh, well, I've got a ULA, I'll just roll on. And that's when it catches them because they're not in control of it anymore. Oracle will come back and say, well, look, you know, we've agreed this figure and the ULA is over now. So you really have to be on top of that and match it up to your projects. Anybody that wants to reduce their costs. So as we said, if you don't deploy all of your 50 CPUs, Oracle will not come back and say, well, that's fine, I'll just charge you for 10 then, because they said, well, I'm really sorry, that's where it is. You've made that agreement, and it's not my fault that you didn't deploy them. So, the Oracle aren't flexible on this if you don't reach your limit. So you really need to make sure that you factor in the Oracle agreement into everything you're doing, and you understand exactly where you are on your roadmap. And Oracle have got a big barrier at the end of that roadmap, so you need to make sure that everything's in order for that time. Audit protection, we said earlier that it will give Oracle some audit, or will give you some audit protection from Oracle. That's true, but it's not guaranteed. So if, for example, 2 years into your ULA, Oracle suspect that maybe they could get some more revenue from you, then they may send the audit team in anyway. So it's not a guarantee. It can, it's a good argument to say that it's less likely, but it's not guaranteed. And then finally, really the thing that people don't necessarily realize, I think, that the world's moved on. So when people used to have a Microsoft or an Oracle or a Sybase or something strategy, then that was the old world. In the new world, we've got all sorts of new things: SaaS, cloud, open source vendors, Kubernetes, all these other things, and people deploy systems differently now. So you don't make the strategy write everything to Oracle. You don't do that anymore. What you do is you take the best from all over the world and all over the best products, and you glue them together and you make your best system. You use RPA and AI and all those good things. So you don't say, right, I'm going to do everything Oracle. So I think the world's moved on from that time, and so be very, very careful that you understand the ULA if you go into one, because it might not actually suit you. Mark, what's your experience?
I agree with everything you say. I mean, ULAs are not good. The key thing to me is the top line here. If you've got a static, as a business, if you've got a flat or declining business in terms of financials, if you've got a static or declining usage of Oracle or Oracle estate going forward, then ULAs are best avoided, because as Mark mentioned earlier, when you get into these things, you set a baseline, whether it's 50 CPUs or 5,000 database licenses, whatever it is, whatever the baseline is in the ULA. If you don't use that and you consistently use less than that, and maybe you've got a declining curve during the term, you are still paying for all of those licenses and for their support for the duration. There is no mechanism here annually to just move to, turn the dial down, or true down in Microsoft terms, or whatever you want to call it. The mechanism is set with a hard floor, and if you work below that floor and don't consume as much as you anticipated, you will end up paying for a lot of licenses and support going forward, and you'll come out of this paying for it in the future, even if you credit out. And I do want to pick up one of the other points on this, which is the audit point. I had a client not so long ago who thought this was an audit defense program. They thought, get a ULA in, Oracle will leave us alone, they'll never come knocking at the door, it's unlimited, so why would they even bother counting from an audit perspective? We've got to be compliant if it's unlimited, isn't it? And they were audited by Oracle 2 years into a 3-year ULA, and they were found massively non-compliant. Not only for products that are outside the ULA, because usually clients have some stack of products in the ULA and then a bunch of products outside of ULA in the sort of standard licensing mode. So they were found non-compliant in the outside bit, which you can kind of suspect that may occur. But they were also found non-compliant for various elements of the stuff that's in the ULA. Where what had happened there, big global organization, they'd heard they got a ULA with Oracle. People in different parts of the world were thinking, oh, we can use any Oracle product as much as we like and just spin it out and deploy it up. And that's not the case. If you've got, for instance, database products in your ULA, but maybe the tuning pack or other elements of it are outside of the ULA, but your users think tuning pack's part of the ULA because it's part of the database stack, isn't it? So I can use that. So you can soon see how, if everybody doesn't understand about how ULA are licensed, what is licensed in the ULA, and what the restrictions are around that, so what you can and can't do, and nobody can get that communication out to every user of Oracle in a large global organization, you're inevitably going to get people spinning up things that they shouldn't do and doing things that they shouldn't do, which for the audit team at Oracle is manna from heaven. In they come. And they, as I say, not so long ago, I had a ULA client who thought it was audit defense, and he found that he was just as non-compliant as he was elsewhere. So just be very careful. If that's the only reason you're going into a ULA, don't do it.
Thanks for that, Mark. And one thing that's really stuck out for me there was your last point around the audit protections, because I've never really considered that side of it before. Is there any kind of gotchas that companies should really look out for?
There are a multitude. I'll give you one prime one, which again, I've seen people trip up on time and time again. When a ULA is signed, part of the ULA agreement includes the entities that are allowed to enjoy the use of that ULA. Those are, your company, your subsidiaries, your affiliates, whatever it may be. There's a list of them. They're all stacked up in the appendix in the ULA. But of course, companies sign up a ULA and they put it in a drawer, and then a year later or 18 months later, they go and acquire somebody. They acquire a business. And if they're not thinking this through and they haven't understood the nature of the ULA, they think they can just bring that business in. If they got Oracle licenses, they can just bring that into the ULA. Or if they haven't got Oracle licenses, they can just take advantage of the ULA and Oracle licensing through that. And away they go. And Oracle watch out for this all the time. They watch out for existing ULA customers who go and acquire somebody during the term. Because many companies just forget that those acquired companies are not part of the ULA. They're not listed in the list of entities who can take advantage of that ULA. And if they're not in that, but the client then uses Oracle licenses from the ULA for that acquired company, that's in breach of the terms of the ULA. So that's what the audit team go hunting for. So it's a classic example of something to be aware of, and something to think about when you think about the restrictions of a ULA. It is only the entities that you sign up for at the beginning of the ULA. It's not what your business might do during the ULA. So just be very careful.
So carrying on from that, what's changed? So ULAs used to be a great deal, and they seem to have soured over time. What are the factors that have played into that? Mark B, if I could get you to start.
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, just in the normal world, if I can call it that, a lot of customers got into ULAs and then found they weren't fit for purpose, because they didn't consume as much as they thought. They ended up paying too much. They didn't like the restrictions of it, and then eventually got themselves out of it. So, that's kind of, well, let's call that business as usual world. But clearly, 2020, here we are. We've got a pandemic now. Who knew this was coming along? The world has changed, and everything to do with contracts has changed, particularly with contracts that are based on usage or users or employee count or revenues, whatever it may be. Look what's happened to pretty much every business in the last 2 or 3 or 4 months. From a demand perspective, most customers with ULAs now, or even considering getting into ULAs, but certainly ones with ULAs, have seen demand diminish because perhaps their revenues are down, they furloughed staff, they're not using the products as much as they anticipated. In fact, they're starting to think about shrinking their business. They may be looking at divestments they weren't thinking of. So a lot of planned activity to maybe shrink a business has been accelerated or forced upon them because of the pandemic and the way the economy has reacted to that through lockdowns and economies back in the deep freeze. So demand has shrunk. Now, remember earlier we talked about when is a ULA bad? A ULA is bad when you got a static or declining usage, either from an economic perspective or from a licensing perspective. Well, guess what? In the pandemic, anyone who's got a ULA is probably using it less than they anticipated. So guess what? A ULA is probably a bad license agreement to have through a pandemic. Now, who knew it was coming? We didn't know it was coming. But here's the thing to think about. When you think about ULAs for the next time, if you're going to renew one, think hard about it, especially after this period now. And obviously think about, getting out of it to give yourself flexibility to reduce costs as your business demands through this pandemic, because your budgets, from a budget perspective, are getting squeezed. Now, that's not only new budgets, which for many customers have been either put on ice or kick the can down the road or just cancel completely, whatever it is. And by the way, that's affected Oracle as well. So Oracle's pipeline has shrunk or perhaps collapsed from a new business perspective. So not only are customers trying to hang on to cash, but they're certainly not giving net new business to Oracle, which makes them a little bit more creative in ways of trying to find business. But when budgets have crimped and usage has crimped, none of those businesses should be using ULA for both of those reasons, as we've explained earlier. Unless, of course, you're one of the very few businesses where this is terrible time has actually been good for you economically in terms, maybe supplying healthcare products, maybe food deliveries to home, whatever it may be. So in those certain circumstances, some businesses are flying, and maybe there's a ULA good for them. That might be a good place for Oracle sales guys to go looking. But for everybody else, for the 98% of businesses, who are seeing a constrained and constricted economy and reduced revenues and reduced usage, like we said earlier, it's not a good place for ULAs. And then from a technology perspective, I mentioned earlier about, Oracle seeing their new business sales getting crimped here. They're going to be out looking for business because they need to sell technology. They need users and customers to continue consuming Oracle products and growing an Oracle estate, whether that's new products or whether that's getting on-premise to cloud, whatever it may be. Oracle's keen to sell and push technology, but the world has kind of shut the doors and shut their wallets and shut their purses and said, look, we're not spending net new money. So what does that mean? It means Oracle's going to get a little bit more aggressive later in this year, I suspect, looking for ways to generate new money. Now, it's either flipping somebody who doesn't have a ULA to buy a ULA for all the reasons we mentioned earlier, or if you've got an existing ULA, maybe trying to renew it early, but trying to extend the term and increase the capacity of it, or throw an audit team in. So for whatever reason, you have to think of it as a two-sided coin. There's you trying to save money on one side of the coin, and perhaps because of that, maybe ULAs aren't right for you. The other side of the coin, Oracle trying to increase their revenues, and they love ULAs, so they're trying to push people to ULAs. So the world has completely changed since February, March 2020, and it won't be the same for some time to come. So just be very conscious of that. If you've got a ULA, think about maybe getting out of it. We'll talk about that soon. And if you're being proposed a ULA, think twice about it. Think hard about it. Mark, did you want to finish off anything on this slide?
Thanks, Mark. I think the other bit is really around the technology side of things. We touched on it earlier. Back in the day, you used to buy the Oracle ULA and then deploy all your systems because you would build your system yourself. You'd have a database, and then nobody brought out a package system, 15 years ago that actually suited your needs. And as the world's moved on, organizations, they used to build a system to meet their requirements. Now they change their business processes to meet the system because they want to take advantage of that pre-packaged software. So the amount of systems you're building has gone down, and the reasons you're building them have changed. So now there's a lot more robotic process automation where you're linking one system to another. And using, if you're deploying a new system, you don't automatically go, right, I'll put it on an Oracle database in a server in the server room. You say, well, I'm going to probably put it on a cloud. So where am I going to put it? I might put it in Amazon Cloud, and I might use their tools to build it because that makes sense. Or I might put it in Microsoft Azure. And what you're actually doing these days is you're putting systems and packages and linking them together. And so all that technology has changed anyway. So you made some great points there, Mark, about not spending so much in IT, but people are also spending wisely. And when they have to spend, they'll do it at the cheapest possible technology, but the most up-to-date one. So these Oracle things, the Oracle software really hasn't changed much for many years. It's good, solid software, but it's not on the leading edge anymore. So the technology bit has particularly changed. So I think, and all these things are much more available these days. So, you've got a wider choice. So really look hard at your reasons for ULAs. And I think you made a very good point about COVID-19 and the world we live in these days. Most organizations, picking up on your point, 98% probably need to certify out of that ULA. Even if you're not going to get out of it, make sure you're ready to get out of it and make sure you can, because then you're in control. And you really need to be in control at this time. And money is key.
Thanks for that. And just before we move on into the next section, in preparation for this webinar, we got quite a few different questions and emails through, particularly around ULAs and some of the misconceptions around ULAs. And we identified 3 kind of key myths that keep coming up whenever people talk about ULA. So we're going to go through each one of those. And the first one of those is the myth that ULAs are easy to get out of. Mark Smith, could you start us off with this one?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah. So in theory, getting out of a ULA is fairly simple. It's a process called certification. So what you do is you declare or certify to Oracle what software you've used from your ULA and the volumes, and you get that signed by a C-level exec, and then you submit that to Oracle and the job's done. So simple. But in reality, obviously, Oracle could challenge that. There is no process which says Oracle has to agree your certification. You can certify and you're out. However, obviously the Oracle sales reps are going to get wind of this certification and knock on the door and say, well, it's not really as simple as just telling me how many licenses you've used, because we need to go through all of the deployments and we need to understand how they're deployed, where they're deployed. And it's a really complex process. So Oracle will see fear in that and start to mention things like audits, and because obviously then that's an opportunity for the Oracle sales guy to sell you another ULA, but to extend the first one. So, be careful about how you go through this process. And really, it's not just about counting how many licenses you have. The real gotchas are in and around the contract term. Because, and they go back 15, 20 years, some of them, because what Oracle does is it has a contract term for the ULA with a number of clauses, and then those contracts refer to web pages, and they've got different clauses on, and you need to understand that whole thing. And I've been in this business for over 20 years, and I wouldn't do it myself. I would get an expert in who's lived and breathed these things, because what your Oracle contract says now, and you look at the one ULA, it's probably not the same as the ULA you signed 3 years ago, because the terms will have changed. Oracle constantly improves its contract terms in its own benefit. So you need to understand that whole complexity. And then when you do get ready to certify out, having consulted experts and got people in to help you with that, then you are completely in control of everything. But it's not as simple as just counting the number of licenses and sending them off to Oracle. Even if Oracle do offer to help in this process as well, because this was an old trick that Oracle used for many, many years. They would say, well, let's help make sure that you're making the most of your licenses. And they would approach it in that way and suggest that they would come and help you. And of course, what they really used to do was what Oracle called optimize the licenses. And they would use that term, let's help you optimize your licenses. But optimizing licenses in your mind is not the same as it is in Oracle's mind. In Oracle's mind, that means sell more. So what they're coming in to do is they're going to audit you, and they're going to say it starts off as an optimized process, and then they come in with the audit team, and then they find some non-compliance, and then guess what? One of the ways out of the non-compliance is to buy another ULA. So if you let yourself be on the back foot in that relationship, that's probably what's going to happen. So the thing to do is make a decision to get out of it, plan effectively, plan a date in the future when you're going to do that, and then make sure you get some expert advice to understand exactly how to do that. And as long as you're in control of that, then at the end of that, you simply certify out. And it can be that simple, but you're going to have to take some time, and you're going to have to get some help on that. So, Mark, have you seen this sort of thing in the past?
Exactly. I take your point, and you can't stress it enough to say you need to take your time about getting out of a ULA. This is not something you do in the last 30 days or even the last 90 days. You've got a lot of homework to do to evaluate your estate and your license position. So you need software asset management people involved, and I'm sure tools. You need people with good contractual understanding of ULAs. So what are you contracted for? What are you committed to do? Are you still compliant to that? Make sure you haven't done anything you shouldn't have done over the years. And then you also need to, with the IT folks, to be talking about, okay, what are we going to be doing with Oracle going forward? What is the kind of Oracle relationship we want? What is the kind of Oracle estate we want when we get out of a ULA? Because the ULA may have been a good tool for you historically, but probably or possibly it's not a good tool going forward. So you need all of the people from asset management, from procurement, from contractual knowledge of the Oracle ULAs, from IT, potentially from finance, because there's a financial element incorporated here, all involved in this process over a long period of time, so you get it right. And you can do it right. You get the right people involved, whether you got those skills internally or, as Mark says, you bring them from external places. You can do this right. You can accredit out of a ULA and do it in a nice, simplified, calm manner that is financially attractive to you. So you can get out. So you can do it. But remember, as Mark said at the beginning of this, actually, this is not what Oracle wants you to do. Oracle loves ULAs, and they love rolling ULAs, and they want you to roll. So their effort will be into continuing the ULA and growing the ULA, not in accrediting you out. Now, of course, if you tell them and you bang the drum enough, they get the message that, okay, you're coming out of this. And as Mark says, it's highly likely they will offer to put in their optimizing team, as Mark nicely calls them. It's usually kind of like the audit guys by another name. they're looking, they want to get under the covers with this. They want to see whether you're compliant. They want to encourage you to, deploy more licenses or to come out of the ULA at a higher watermark than you would like to. So, they've got a kind of second mission here. It's not just to help you optimize from the general sense, but also optimize it for Oracle going forward. So I would always advise, Forrester would always advise that, if you're going to get anyone external in to help you prepare to get out of a ULA, then get an independent party who understands Oracle licensing, asset management, licensing rules and contractual complexities. They're the best people to help you get out of this, because they'll give you just a clean, independent view that gives you direction here that you can follow. If you're letting Oracle do that for you, well, then whatever you end up with, that's, you're kind of asking for that. So as Mark says, take a lot of time, prepare well, do it right. You can get out cleanly, but if you need to take independent advice, then grab it, but make sure it's independent advice.
A really interesting point there around that independent advice, Mark. But do you have any kind of best practice about how to engage those people? When they come in, what's the best way of operating?
There's a key thing here around the word independent. Obviously, Oracle isn't independent. It goes without saying. But when you look at third parties out there, asset management companies, whatever they may want to call themselves, you've got a spectrum. You've got some people who are hand in glove with Oracle, perhaps are resellers of Oracle products as well as doing asset management, and have a vested interest in obviously trying to sell you Oracle stuff as well, because they're paid commission by Oracle to do that. That's their job. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you'll have people in that independent space, let's call it that, who are truly independent, who have no vested interest in trying to sell you Oracle products or services. And from my perspective, I would always advise, if you're looking for someone external, it has to be independent, and get as independent an organization as you possibly can. So you're looking for an organization that has no vested interest in trying to sell you products or services of Oracle's. So some of the asset management tools, accredited by Oracle, they're kind of closer to Oracle because they're accredited and they're kind of trying to help Oracle. So you just there's a spectrum. So you just need to look down the spectrum to somebody who's truly independent. And I'd just ask the question, if you're trying to evaluate independent advisor to get you through this accreditation period, just say to them, hey, look, are you truly independent of Oracle? Are you connected in any way, legally or whatever, to Oracle in terms of being a reseller for them, or trying to promote their products or services, or getting any sort of remuneration for doing that? And that's a question to ask right up front. And clearly, if they are, they're in that sort of middle camp. Now, you might still like them. That's fine if you want to pursue that route. But if you want true independence, you need to find somebody who has no vested interest in Oracle selling you more product or service.
Thanks, Mark. And on that point, we were an Oracle partner, for about just over 20 years. So we have a really deep understanding of how things work. And, we terminated that partnership something like 18 months ago now, because we needed to be independent. We didn't want to have to toe any company line for Oracle. So we made the decision for the benefit of our customers to cut that partnership. But, those 20 years have really meant that we understand a lot about how this works, a lot about how Oracle works, and we can use that to help our customers get the best deal for them. Really.
Great. So moving on to our second myth, which is that ULAs are cost effective. And I can see how this would be an easy one to imagine, considering it's, that whole unlimited aspect of it. But the reality, from what I understand, is that they're not so cost effective, especially when it comes to renewals. Mark Smith, could you take us through this?
Sure, thanks, Dan. And this example, what we're going to do is just run you through a typical customer and how they might engage and get into a ULA, and what it might kind of cost them, and how things roll on, and how it becomes more and more expensive. So in this example, there's a customer, let's say they've got some existing Oracle licenses and they're paying something like £1 million a year in support. And they know they're going to do a lot of projects, and so they go on get an agreement with Oracle for a ULA for a 3-year term. So what then happens is Oracle will encourage that customer to roll that existing license and support into the support for the main a new agreement. And the reason for that is so that the customer has one invoice from Oracle. So that all sounds good. So the customer says, right, okay, I'm going to buy £10 million worth of licenses to allow me to deploy, let's say, 3 systems. And the support on that, let's say, is around about 2 million. So I'll be paying 3 million a year for support because I've rolled my 1 million in, and that's all fine. So now you're on that journey, you've got your licenses and you're paying £3 million a year for support. So roll forward 3 years and all those the projects that you were going to deliver, let's say that you only managed to deliver something like half of what you intended. So it comes to the end of the 3-year term and you say to Oracle, right, I'd like to certify out. And the gotcha there is that Oracle say, right, that's fine. So certify what products have you used? What products are actually live and operational? And because they're the ones that you can only certify. You can't certify ones unless they're on a live system and in use. So you say to Oracle, well, I've only actually deployed maybe half of this. So but I've nearly finished the latest project to deploy all of it. And so Oracle will say to you, well, that's fine, but you know, at this point of certification, you've only deployed half the licenses, so your grant is half. So you're now thinking, well, hang on a minute, I've spent 10 million on this, and I've only deployed £5 million worth of licenses, so I'm out of pocket. So what Oracle will then say to you is, well, you know, why don't we sell you a new ULA to extend it so you can finish that project and everything be good. So you then say, well, okay, so how do I do that? And Oracle say, well, you need to buy another £10 million worth of ULA, and we'll put some other stuff in there, so we'll kind of sweeten the deal for you. But you need a new ULA to roll over and then enable your next project. So you can see that there's a gravy train starting to leave the station, where this thing is never going to actually end, and you can end up in a perpetual cycle of ULAs. So if you come to that point and you extend the ULA and you say, okay, I'll bite the bullet, I'll do some more projects, they're going to charge you 10 million for, let's say, in this scenario, and then another 2 million for that support. So your support going forward now is 5 million, and you're investing another 10 of capex. And if you ask Oracle at this point, you say, well, hang on a second, you know, I thought this was kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet. Oracle's response to that is, well, you know, it is an all-you-can-eat buffet, but you came and you only had a starter, and that's not my fault. So their logic is they're going to charge you again. You're going to go to the all-you-can-eat buffet again. And hopefully this time you'll get it right. But you know what? If you don't get it right, and this happens again and again and again, you can see those support costs are stacking, and that can go on pretty much forever. So this is how a ULA becomes not only really expensive for you, the customer, but why Oracle love them so much is because they're stacking, and there is no end in sight. And so in order to manage that ULA, you can see that you really need to be on top of everything. And this is why this whole webinar talks about how serious these things are. And, you know, there's loads of organizations trapped in these things, and they are costing millions and millions and millions. And, you know, if you don't certify out and you get the audit threat, and then you agree to another ULA, how do you actually get out of this? Mark, is this the sort of thing that you see a lot?
It's like a treadmill, isn't it? It's like the hamster wheel. You get on and it just keeps going and it keeps going. Of course, Oracle want you to do that. You know, they love this financial licensing model. It's perfect for them. So why not? Keep renewing, keep adding, keep renewing, keeps out the competition, all the things we've said before on the webinar. And it, you know, is it cost effective? For a very small subset of Oracle clients, it is. For those fast-growing, fast-deploying organizations, yes, you know, this can be an incredibly attractive, cost-effective model. For a large majority of ULA clients, especially now with pandemic and the economy where it is, and it's going to be a couple of 3 years of bumpiness going forward, you know, should you be in a model like this? It's a big question mark, isn't it? And I just want a quick thing I just wanted to point out, because I got asked this by a client not so long ago. I mean, in February, whenever it was. It was, you know, they were looking at a ULA, and they were talking about, you know, when you get into it, you know, the existing perpetual licenses you got, when you go into the ULA, those existing licenses get terminated. They just disappear into smoke. And because, you know, you put those effectively the licenses and the support stream into the ULA. But they were under the illusion, I don't know where they got it from. They thought they could do a ULA and then come out of it and they still have those perpetual licenses because they're perpetual, aren't they? Aren't they as right to use forever? And I said, no. When you go in, they get terminated, so they're gone. So you can't go back to them and just say, Oracle, you know, we're going to use the old perpetual licenses and not pay support, which is their original thinking. I really don't know where they got it from. But it was a bit of a rude awakening for them. So for them, they then chose not to go into a ULA. You know, they were going into it for all the wrong reasons because they'd taken bad advice from somewhere. So, you know, do understand how you get in, what the implications are, as Mark's just outlined, in terms of how these things go and how these things grow. And of course, you need to know that you can get out of it at an appropriate time when it's right for your business to do so, or when the economy forces you to do so. But, you know, are they cost effective? Yes, for a small number of Oracle ULA users. I suspect for the vast majority of them, certainly now, they're proven to be quite financially expensive licensing models.
One thing I wanted to add there, Mark, was if we consider what happens to an Oracle estate over time. So because you're starting to roll your licenses together into, you know, ULAs that are topping each other, and you've got what Oracle calls the total support stream. Basically, those products and those licensing there, you can't take them out. So, you know, if you first ULA and the second ULA stacked up there, and you've maybe got licenses for 150 CPUs, but you then decide that you're going to retire one system, and you know, maybe it's a huge system, and you lose 50 CPUs. Oracle will not reduce the price. So you'll go back to Oracle and say, well, look, Mr. Oracle, I only need 100 CPUs now on my ULA. Oracle will say, well, guess what? When you negotiated this with me in the first place, I gave you a great deal. So if you want to reduce the number of licenses you hold, we can do that for you, but the price is probably not going to go down. So you end up in a situation where you've got this whole license grant and older systems are retiring, but you're still paying support and maintenance on software that you're not using. So it's a really difficult thing to manage, and you need to really understand all these nuances if you're going to make a success of managing your ULA.
Just following up on your initial point there, Marquez, around the stacking of those support costs, and as you've shown, you go from 1 million pre-ULA all the way up to 5 million after the first renewal. What happens after that ULA if that organization certified out? Do they go back to the 1 million? What happens?
Thanks, Dan. Well, I'm sure any Oracle customer will recognize that Oracle never charge you less this year than they did last year. So, you know, you're always going to be stuck in that stream, unfortunately. You know, if that ULA stream was built up from 1 million to 3 million to 5 million, you're always going to be paying at least 5 million. And then there are 4% increases a year, right up until the point that, you know, even if you certify out, you're still using those licenses. So the only way to actually reduce that in the end is to look away from Oracle to another vendor, somebody like Support Revolution, who offer third-party support. That's the way that you can reduce the cost. But Oracle are not going to come in there and offer to reduce the cost year on year because you're using less licenses. So I guess the other way of making it more cost effective for yourself is by deploying those licenses on new systems, which you certainly can do. But as we said before, you're probably deploying old tech now. So, you know, have you really got, I don't know, let's say you've got a 50 CPU licenses spare. Is there a new system that ideally you would want to build on Oracle? Probably not. So, you know, it is a difficult situation, but you are, whatever bill you've got stuck at the end of your ULA with, that's going to be basically a forever bill until you leave Oracle.
Thanks. And then the final myth that we wanted to bust was that ULAs are simple and transparent. Mark B, I think you're best place to start off this particular discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, they are simple and transparent at this sort of framework approach. If you just think about it, okay, it's an unlimited license agreement for a term for a fixed fee. That sounds good. And if you take it at that conceptual level, it is simple. But if you look at it at the contractual level, these things are very well written by Oracle, and a lot of customers don't spend the time understanding the nuances of the licensing and the contractual obligations that they've got during the term and when they're getting out of the term and everything else. And there are some hyperlinks often in these agreements, and those hyperlinks are to things that change over time, and who's tracking that, if anybody. So conceptually, it's a very simple thing to think about, and at a conceptual level, relatively easy for Oracle to sell. But when you're buying it, you really need to get under the covers with this thing and read the small print. Like any agreement, any license agreement, read the small print, because the advantages of unlimited are there if that's right for you as a business, but the restrictions and the cost implications, if you get this wrong, can be quite substantial. Now, of course, any good starting point, if you're looking at Oracle, you know, they do publish quite a bit of material on their own website. You know, there's their software investment guide. It's a good start, a bit high level, to be honest, but it's a good start to start understanding what these ULAs are all about and how they're written and who they're good for and why you should use them and everything else. But then look at your ULA contract, and you must understand the nuance of it because it's so easy to get non-compliant. You know, I mentioned earlier in the webinar different ways people get non-compliant within ULAs and they think it's an audit defense, but it isn't. So unless you understand the terminology and what you're allowed to do, and obviously by definition what you're not allowed to do, you know, unless you know that throughout and you can communicate that to all parties who engage and use that ULA or use the licensing of the ULA or responsible for the ULA, if that's not continually communicated out and everybody understands it, then things can get a little awry and you can fall down a few pit holes. And there's complications in the contract itself. Even some of the wording in there is not the simplest of wording or the clearest of wording. There's a little opaqueness, let's call it that. And perhaps deliberately so from Oracle's side, in the sense that they write these things in their favor. Of course they do. It's their software, it's their intellectual property. But at the same time, they write things in a way that is clearly in their favor if there's ever a dispute, because, you know, it's their property and they want to protect it. But obviously it's kind of skewed towards Oracle, and all the agreements are skewed towards Oracle. So you need to completely understand before you get into a ULA what you're getting into. You need to monitor it during the ULA process, or else you will get out of compliance, or you will deploy too much software and you will end up paying way more than you need to. And then, of course, you need to understand the agreement specifically well when you're starting to think of getting out of it. So you need to understand the nuances of how you accredit out of the thing and how you go through that whole process, what you need to do and when you need to do it. Because at the end of the day, when you get out of a ULA, one of your senior executives, whether it's your CIO or your CFO, is going to sign off on that accreditation numbers as you come out of the ULA to say this is a true and valid picture of our Oracle usage today. And if those numbers are not right, you're putting an executive in a risky position there if they're signing off on something that's not completely accurate, if you haven't done that right. So from before you get in, you need to understand these contracts clearly and the nuances of them. During, you need to monitor it constantly. Don't just rely on a software asset management tool to help you with these things. You need to monitor the contract and usage and your restrictions and flexibility. You need to monitor all of that. And as you plan to get out of it, you need to be very careful of how you do that. Or else, what are you going to do? You're going to end up licensing, you're going to have too much licensing, you're going to pay for too much, and you're trapped into a big support cost, as Mark's just explained on the previous slide going forward. You know, at the previous example, at 5 million a year support costs going forward, you know, maybe you're only using product that would have £3 million support costs going forward if you'd used, you know, that was the actual number, but you end up paying 5 million. So if you're not managing this thing correctly, and if you're not looking at the contract yourself and understanding how that works for you, then you're leaving yourself open to make mistakes, and mistakes cost money. Marques, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. You made some great points there. I think there's a funny thing that I've found the other day. Well, it's not really that funny, but the Oracle Software Investment Guide. You know, this used to be referenced in everywhere. You know, saying if you actually want to understand software, look at that. Oracle would refer people to it as well, because you know what they would say is, well, because if they came in and audited a customer and the customer was non-compliant, then the first reaction from the customer would be, well, you know, I don't understand this licensing, it's too complicated. And Oracle's, you know, the way that Oracle answers, they say, well, look, it's not my fault that you don't understand it. It's your need to understand these things. It's your responsibility. And if they pointed them to the Software Investment Guide, that thing was really it is quite complicated, you know, because there are some really funny terms in there that you need to understand. Things like, you know, if you have certain products, then you have to have these other products licensed on the same basis as these products, and then the products are licensed on different metrics, you know, the named user plus processors and some line items for other particular pieces of software. So it is a complicated thing. But the funny thing that I found the other day was I hadn't looked at this guide for many years, so I googled it and I thought, well, it's not coming up. Oracle have taken it off the Oracle website. I mean, that's how helpful they're being. But, you know, the thing with that is, well, picking up on Mark's point, you know, it's their software. They're looking to generate revenue. Why would they publish documents to help you minimize the amount you pay? I mean, they've obviously realized that and taken that down. I clicked on links on Oracle's own documents to get to this document, and those links take you now, guess where? They take you to the price list page. So instead of helping you understand your software, they just saying, here's some more to buy. And you can look at those price lists, but they're really, really complicated. The good news is you can still find that software investment guide. Obviously, a number of Oracle user groups over the world have published them, and they're on document sites. So you can Google it and can find it. It's just not where you thought it might be. So I think with all this complexity, all the things that Mark's saying, the fact that audit tools are out there to help you, yes, they are, but those contract terms, no audit tool can help you understand all of that. So very complicated area. And if Forrester are telling you that you need to take this seriously, then really follow their advice.
Thanks for that. And okay, so we've covered the three main myths that people have written into us about, but say then you want to get out of your ULA. What are the tips that you can give us to certify out? What's the best practice? Mark S, if you could start this off.
Thanks, Dan. Well, the main tip, the first tip, start early. So in the Oracle agreements, there's a clause which says basically, well, you have to certify. If you want to get out of your ULA, you have to certify out within 30 days. Now, it doesn't say 30 days before your renewal date or 30 days after your renewal date, but it says 30 days. So people kind of look at that and take that as what to do. But there's nothing to stop you certifying out of your ULA basically 12 months early. So let's say you're into a 3-year ULA, you're 2 years into it, and you're going to finish your project on time because you're going to make it go live. Maybe you go live with the number of users you want and using the software you want, but you're going to cut down the scope a little bit so that you can make sure you deliver on time. Then you could issue that ULA certification, 11, 12 months early. That way, you've given yourself plenty of time to get everything in order, to do the correct certification process, and Oracle know you're going to go out. If they're going to challenge it, it gives you time to end it. But best practice, start early, start 12 months in advance. And when we say be in control of the timeline, so if you're setting that date that ULA is going to finish, it's a hard date. Oracle's not going to move it. Or they may move it. I've seen them move it once or twice in the past if they're going to extend to another ULA. But they might move it only for their own reasons, generally, not for yours. So make sure that you're in control of that timeline. And make sure you have all the expertise and the processes and you follow those through. So on the second step there, the self-audit, identify all the line items on your Oracle agreements and map them onto your estate. So what people forget is that they have a number of licenses within the ULA, and then maybe they map it onto a system, and they forget that they've got these other licenses from an old system. The old system's not being used anymore. Well, those licenses, if they're still part of that ULA, you can map them onto a new system. These licenses that you've bought are not tied to any particular system, so you can use all those within your grant. But make sure you understand line by line where those systems are deployed, which products are where, and understand the types of usage. So understand exactly, be very careful for things like cloud, because Oracle issued a guidance about, I think, 2017, 2018, of which clouds they recognize. So if you put your software into Microsoft Azure or into Amazon Cloud, then Oracle do recognize that. But there are some nuances. There are some restrictions within the Amazon clouds, which mean you need to understand exactly the types of use that you're allowed to use your Oracle for, licenses for, and what Amazon products they map onto. So be very, very diligent about all that. And as we've said a number of times throughout this webinar, seek advice. I said earlier, I've been doing this for 20 years. If I was in your shoes as a customer with a ULA, I would get advice, because there are people out there that know and understand every single contract term and can be in your corner. So it's that kind of advice that you need. And there are things that Oracle have done recently around semantics around licensing terms. So there's a thing called the matching service level policy. And Oracle sales guys will tell customers that means that if you have any Oracle software, and I've heard this, that you can't cancel any of it. So let's say you've got a ULA, but let's say you've also got some other licenses. They'll say, no, you can't cancel anything. Well, that's obviously preposterous. I mean, because if you had a basket of Oracle software, that would mean that you could never stop paying Oracle for anything, even if you had multiple agreements. And of course you can. So what Oracle tend to do with that matching service server policy is try and bamboozle customers with it. What it actually means is if you have Oracle products, let's say it's a database and some options like tuning pack or partitioning, then all of the software relating to that particular deployment on one system has to be the same service level policy. So for example, in that scenario, your Oracle database, your partitioning and tuning either have to be all in support with Oracle or all out of support with Oracle. That's what it means. But don't let Oracle bamboozle you with these terms and say, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. Make sure you get that advice and get somebody fighting your corner so that you can't get tricked or tripped up, or any kind of sales tactics that they might deploy. So it is a complicated process, but with the right help, it is going to follow the timeline, and you're going to be able to follow those 3 steps and guide yourself out. Mark, anything to add on this?
No, I think you covered it really well there, Mark. I mean, I just reiterate the start early piece. I've seen too many customers leave it too late to start considering getting out of a ULA, to the extent that they end up just rolling the ULA because that's the easiest thing to do, on Oracle's terms. So it's an increased ULA going forward, and they're trapped in that for another 3 years. And then they've learned the lesson. So another 2.5 years down the track, or 2 years down the track, then they start to plan early and get out. But it's cost them another 3 years on the treadmill of the ULA. So start early is, the biggest thing to take away from this slide completely. It's just, there's too many people made too many mistakes and just rolled again. And it's an expensive roll of the dice just to keep renewing a ULA.
Thanks for that. And so you've covered the 3 kind of best practices to certify out of a ULA. I then wanted to cover the one last thing, which was, what is the main reason that you can see for leaving a ULA? What's, from your perspective, is the reason you should be considering this? Mark S., if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks, Dan. One massive reason to leave the ULA, obviously to save costs. In this pandemic world of where everybody's under pressure, everybody wants to save money. And as we said before, Oracle are in the business of maintaining their revenues. They need to declare to their shareholders they're making profits. They can't go around just kind of allowing you to pay nothing more and cut your bills massively. So you need to look elsewhere. And if you look to somebody like a Sales Support Revolution, then you can use third-party support. It replaces everything that Oracle gives you currently, so you get all the kind of support services 24/7 and all the things that you need. But guess what? We're going to do it for a much lower price. We guarantee to save people at least 50%, and people save up to 90% in some cases. So it's a great way in this particular time to help your strategy to move forward, to save some money. And then what you can do is you've got out of that ULA prison. You're no longer going to have those arguments with Oracle every 3 years or whatever it is when your ULA rolls over, because you will be out of the ULA prison. And what can you do with those savings? Well, maybe you could reinvest them in more strategic things like AI, RPA, all the latest buzzwords of projects. But maybe you just bank those savings, because you know all the turbulence that we've had over the recent months, you're going to need to put some money back aside for the things that you want to do, or maybe just for a rainy day. So it's a great way of getting out of the ULA prison and freeing up some funds to be used on something that you'd much rather be spending your organization's money on. So Mark, what do you think?
I agree completely with that. I mean, people who get out of ULAs, they want to have choice. And to me, I love have customers having choice, whatever that may be, choice of competitive products, or choice of where they get their support, or just choice, because you need choice and flexibility in this crazy world we're living in at the moment. Whether you just want to save money or not, you need to have choice anyway, whether we get back to the new normal or whatever it may be. You need choice. So to me, coming out of a ULA gives you choice. You get away from the restrictions of the ULA. Remember, it's not unlimited, it is restrictive. That's perhaps a better title for the licensing term, restrictive licensing agreement. But when you come out of the unlimited license agreement, you then have choice. You have choice, obviously, as you mentioned, about where you put your support and how much you pay for it. And in this day and age where a lot of people want to save money, or they want to fund other projects that have been put on ice or cancelled because there's no new money around, what a great way of potentially saving a vast chunk of support costs going forward, and using that money to fuel and fund other projects in your business. So it's a good thing to have choice. But remember, if you're in a ULA, you don't have that choice. You don't have third-party support as an option. You pay Oracle what the ULA contracts you to pay them, and that's it. And if you roll the ULA, you remain locked out of options and choice, such as third-party support gives you. So if you're in the mindset of we need to save money, if you're in the mindset of we need more flexibility, if they're in the mindset of doing what you want to do with your money, euros, pounds, dollars, whatever it is, then you need to come out of a ULA and give yourself some choices. And of course, that is, one massive reason to get out of the ULA, pandemic or not. Give yourself choices.
Thank you, Mark and Mark, for that incredibly interesting session. Just to finish off, I'd also like to quickly bring the link on the screen to everybody's attention. We've written a short PDF guide on everything that we've covered today for you to download, and do note that you can also find a copy of that in the resources tab on your screen as well. Finally, looking through the questions we've received so far in the session, I think that we've covered them all so far as part of the conversations that have already taken place. And the few that we haven't covered, that's because I think they're quite in-depth and specific. So we will come back to you separately via email. That said, if you do want a more in-depth conversation on any of the subjects we've raised today, you can contact us via phone or email using the details on the screen right now. And finally, thanks to everybody who signed in today to listen to our speakers, and thanks again to both Marks for your time. Also, remember, you will be sent a recording of this webinar to your email, and we recommend downloading those accompanying white papers and fact sheets in that system window. We hope you have a great day, and thanks very much and goodbye.